Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Van Gogh Studies, final session. Today we're going to start where we left off, finish this painting, and we're going to get into the real intricate, just dealing with what some people would call simple subjects. And we're talking about simple subject. What's this? Petals and grass and leaves. It's not as simple as it looks, but ways of taking a simplified or simple subject and exaggerating the color, the brushstroke, the edges, whether they're soft or hard. We're also going to be dealing with broken brushstroke or broken color, meaning you're going to see one color next to the other, and you'll be able to see the actual brushstroke and the laying down of the paint. And we're also going to try to make these brushstrokes directional to give this still life, and we're going to inject it with life and movement. That's what made Van Gogh so special. So touching on those points, let's go ahead and I want to talk about this. This is a paper palette for oil and acrylic. It's a gray matter paper palette. It's amazing. Easiest cleanup you'll ever have. You just have all these sheets of paper here. And it's this heavy paper that waxed. You can lay your paint down. Actually, and I'm working a little bit vertical today, so you'll see a little bit of maybe drip from when I add a vehicle. And I am also going to introduce painter's medium to this final stage of the painting. I'm going to add what is known as linseed oil. For acrylic painters, you will be using acrylic gels or polymers. There's all kinds of different vehicles. They go from extra thick, almost toothpaste consistency, or even thicker, to create that impasto, thickening of the paint look. Obviously, it dulls it down a little bit, all the way to water thin like vehicles that will add gloss or extend the dry period. You know, they won't let them dry as fast. So all these things for textures, matte or gloss finishes that will add that final look that we're looking for. A couple of things that I wanted to show, and we'll do that with close-ups, are going to be how I reintroduced some of that brushstroke over what was considered the first layer. So you see here how we layered the paint, and now we're going to begin to work our way all the way through each flower with a couple of combinations of color. Most of it is going to be, as we know, cobalt blue. So I'm going to start setting up my palette, and let's place our blue right over here. I think I'm going to use about that much. I'm going to make two little piles. One that is going to get cooler, one that is going to get warmer. And by cooler, I don't mean greener. May get a little greener when I mix it on the canvas, but tinting it to lighter and darker. We're going to add, this is going to be very, very little, just a tiny touch of yellow. You have to have it because we do see a tiny bit of orange or browning of some color in the center of the flower. And just with the extremely limited palette, this is a pyrrole red or cadmium red. Let's place it right over here. And again, just a very, very tiny touch. We will be using this for warming up some of this blue, creating a little bit of a violet part of the spectrum, but it's not going to be that much. And if I need to darken a color, we will mix into the violets as well. And obviously we will need lots of white. So I'm going to be adding white right here, and I'll add more as we move through the painting. I think that might be just enough. We are going to be adding a little bit of thickness to the background, and I did finish up some of that color in the foreground from last week. That was the last thing I did, and it was done also as a layer. There's going to be a little bit of light, and you see some easy brushstrokes that just gives it that little bit of volume, perspective, light, movement. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add, if you're oil painter, a little bit of Gamsol into this small container for cleaning our brushes and for mixing paint. If you're working with acrylic, you'll be using water. And here we go. So my brushes today are pretty small, all of them, because I'm looking at the size of what I'm going to be working with, the shapes that I'm looking for when I add my paint. I'm going to be using a lot of line, so I have these two very small, one a little bit larger. This is a number 1, and this is a number 002. So you could see the tips in relationship to what they can do on the canvas. Very, very small. That's the smallest line I can create. This is a little bit thicker, and they're round, and these are 3 flats. So I'll be probably going from one light to one dark, so I don't have to be switching and cleaning my brush every single time. And I'll have one extra one that I need, that I could just mix color, or maybe if I need to add a different one. So where would we start? I want to begin right where we left off in this area here. I am going to be zooming into my reference as much as I can. You may be asking, well, what if I wanted to add more colors? Like, I see some greenish, turquoise. So that's what I'm going to start with over here. So if you're working with acrylic, you're going to have to do this a little bit differently, because if you pre-mix your paints and just leave them there, they're going to dry. So once again, your strategy. What am I going to be working on here? I'm going to have lots of blues and greens. So acrylic painters, you need to mix as you go. You can pre-mix, then paint, and use up what you mix. For oil painters, we have a little more flexibility. So I'm going to grab a chunk of this blue. Ooh, not that much. And I'm going to pre-mix some greens. So I'm going to take a big chunk of this yellow, and I'm using a palette knife for just a little more convenience. And we do our mixing. That's going to be my base green color. It may be a little too yellow. So where we are now is at the stage where we're going to really, really decipher light, shadow within these shapes to break the color. And in order for me to do that, my strategy and what I would see maybe Van Gogh doing would be to pre-mix a green like this, and we're going to see what happens in the palette. So I want to show you that very quickly. I'm going to put this away because I will be using my brushes. Let's see, right here. Grabbing a smaller brush. What I would see happening would be this. Using a little bit of either your painter's medium or your Gamsol, I would see using some of this green that I have here and extending it with maybe a little bit towards the yellow. So you can create variations of this green. Notice how easily we could pull and change the direction, the temperature, the value of that color. Add a little more light so you could see a little bit better. I could also add a little more blue to this side over here. So pulling this green and add darkness. So by pre-mixing this color, what happens? What I have on my brush here is I could take this all the way to blue, honestly. Now the key here is going to be how much paint, because I'm going to need a lot of this paint, not so much of this one, maybe a little more percentage-wise of this one, and bring it all the way to yellow. That's just very, very few touches. So how you set yourself up in terms of quantity, add way more blue here, make it really, really dark. And I could even take this one step further, which Van Gogh didn't really do much of, and that is going to be take it almost all the way to blue. So this is a blue-green. So we're going from blue-green, variation of blue-green, to a dark green, to yellow-green, all the way to yellow. But can you see this was just blue and yellow. But I could grab areas of any of this part of the spectrum with this brush. And as I'm working around, one big tip that I'm going to give you today is squinting. squinting to isolate lights, shadows, and identify where your color is going to be. Now, the next thing is going to be breaking up that brush stroke. So many things happening simultaneously, considering your quality of color, lightness, darkness. Now, do you want to see something amazing? Truly amazing, really. We bring a little bit of white right over here at this end of the spectrum. And I could turn this beautiful color into a tint of it. And look at that. So any of those who saw kind of a turquoise aqua color showing up, that's where it comes from. I could clean my brush, just wiped it, grab a little more white, and I'm going to go right here in the middle and grab a little bit of this green here, and look at that. We have a separate tint. Another color that we see popping up in our painting. So what I'm trying to say is, however you, let's call it what it is, make a mess in your palette. Some of us are more organized and we have to kind of draw little squares and keep the paint inside that square. Some of us just go all over, and I'm a little more of that. Let's see what happens over here. It is about learning to navigate, learning to pre-plan, learning to mix, and as you begin painting, how to use this where you can keep it efficient and be able to bring it freely, loosely, while also using the right brush. Now, one thing you don't want to do is just add color wherever, just because, oh, look, this color looks so pretty, and just bring it over. Does it really fit and belong there? And a little bit of patience from here to here. And there's a small little transition that I really want to focus on today, which is that technique. So I mentioned I'm going to use Painter's Medium, and some of these paints, I just put it on the container, and I'm going to be grabbing just little bits, and you can see how glossy it gets immediately. So this is going to add a little bit of body, a little bit of gloss, a little bit of fluidity to my paint. I could use it also to allow the paint to just mix a little bit on the canvas or on top of my previous layer of paint. So learning how to use these vehicles, those gels, acrylic gels for acrylic painters, or your linseed oils and Gamsols or mixes and ratios of painter's mediums, is crucial. I think once you reach that level where you're absolutely enjoying painting and you want to just push it up a little further, this is where you need to explore. I love this turquoise that just came about. And remember, that's really in the deep blue-green. And I see it a lot right under here. I saw it last week. Now, do I need a lot of this? How I apply that color is going to be what makes this painting become successful, really. So let's see if I can show you a little bit closer what that gloss looks like. So in this area of green, I'm going to zoom in. As I mentioned, some of it is more yellow, so I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow here. Tint it just a little bit with that very light color. I'm going to grab my smallest brush. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing a little bit of Painter's Medium. I'm adding it to this little bit of paint on my palette. And now you're going to see me bring it over right in here. And what I want to do is just begin to, it's almost, we call it painting, but in this case, it's almost drawing. Notice the variation of color there. Did you see that? And I could easily bring a third right at the edge. So in 3 brush strokes, I added a little bit of light, a little bit of shadow, and I want to go a little bit into a little bit of this tint because I do see it and it's very prevalent right at the edges. So I could even go all the way to white. And it's tinted version where I could go even further. And how much time do I need to spend with that petal? That's going to be the question. For the most part, you see that Van Gogh would bring in a heavy load of paint and it looks like he would just swoop it down. Very confidently, very precisely. But there's an element of patience. Yes, I mentioned confidence. So you got to get yourself to that place where you understand why you're bringing that color there. You know why first of all, what the color looks like. Second, you know the shape of the color. So what's the shape that I'm trying to paint in here? It looks almost like a square. After that, I could begin dealing with if there's a lighter or darker shape around that shape. So it's literally just looking for shapes to paint. Little rectangles, squares. You know, when we look at clouds, we see whales or bunnies, or everybody sees something. When you're looking at a petal and you're breaking down the actual brushstroke, I want you to look for shapes within the shape. So don't think you're painting petals here. I want you to look for the direction of the brushstroke. Notice how it gets really, really white with a tiny touch of yellow right in the middle of this. So I'm looking for that, the break of color. And the confidence you show when you bring that paint down and lay it down almost at 1, 2, 3 is what's going to make it lively. It's going to make it beautiful. The way you clean your brush between colors, or if you're doing what I'm doing, which is you have one color for light, one color for dark, and avoiding the temptation to bring, let me show you back on the palette, just yellow right here, a little bit of white right here, because your paint is going to become too primary. So I noticed, you saw that I just added some white and yellow here. What I did was actually tint it. So I had a little bit of this, and you see it over here, this blue, that it was not white. It's a really, really light version of a tinted blue. And for the yellow, I brought in some of that same paint and tinted it right over here. So it's not just pure yellow. So you have all these tints going on where you could easily dip right back into it and just continue to create variations to the look of how the paint actually settles down, sits on the canvas. Grabbing a little more. This has a little bit of yellow in it. And showing a little bit of that patience. What I want to do is here, I want to make my paint thicker. So adding a little bit, and I want to make sure I get that blue that I'm looking for, and make areas where it could get a little bit darker. So adding a lot of these, this is the way I see it. It's not exactly how you should do this. My only tip would be make your colors interesting. When you mix them, the more fun you have mixing your colors. So spending a lot of time on your palette, spending a little more time looking at your subject to narrow down to see, okay, that purity of color, not just straight out of the tube. Avoid that as much as possible. You're going to have a much more beautiful painting if you take the time to look, decipher the color, mix it, and then capture the shape on the canvas. So another thing he's doing here is he's shifting that light to dark. In terms of shapes, in order to capture that juxtaposition, to add volume and space to these flowers. And it is crucial to try to do that as you easily mix your way and step back. Also step back, take a few seconds here and there to see if you are, generally speaking, capturing the feel, the sense of what that petal is supposed to look like. Now there's going to be a little bit of, I'm going to switch to this brush here because we do have background that I'm still contending with here. So I'm going to have an area of, what I did is I mixed a little bit of, there's a tone of pink to it, and I added some yellow. So it almost begins to be like a really, really tinted flesh tone. It's what I was going for. So getting a little bit of white for a thicker background. I'm going to set it up over here. I barely touched it with a tiny bit of red and brought in a little bit of yellow. And I decided that, see, I went with too much red. But you could see already, this is the base color. It's not pink, it's more flesh tone. There's a yellowing to that color. I'm going to bring way more white because I want this really, really tinted. So it doesn't compete with, some of this color will be in some of the center of the flowers, and it could get a little yellower or more orange. And we're going to need a lot of it. So I'm going to grab a lot more white and tint this all the way down. And that is going to be the break. I think we're there. And just to play safe, I'm going to add more white. Just to that. And you may not be able to see the difference right now. But I am going to need that much to do what I want to do to the background in terms of load of paint, that thickness that lays over the background. I'm just going to go ahead and mix all of this, making it almost very there's a perception of a tone to the color, but it almost very, very close to white. I think that's it right there. And I think that warm feeling it has, very different from just the cool, pure white that we would add, also makes these flowers just jump out a little more. And I'm going to be working around the flowers and also the negative space, which now becomes a little bit sharper and smaller in some of these areas. So you see how it begins to break and also create that, what we've been talking about, that hard edge, that separation of space and flower. And I'm making this paint very, very thick, breaking the brush stroke and allowing it to have that, the word is body. So for example, you see some of these areas here, and I want to play a little more with them. Notice the amount of white paint that I'm going to add here and how I with a directional brush stroke and a very small brush, I can just dab it down. Sometimes it mixes just a little at the edges. So once again, clean your brush, stay patient, load it up, and dab it down. We begin to see it a little bit. So notice the thickness. And I almost want to show you the difference between the color I mixed and if I were to just grab some pure white right out of the tube. I'm going to do it right here next to it so you could see it. Oh, it mixed up a little. So how you play with the negative space between these flowers is also going to be a big part of it. We saw it in the drawing, how it really assisted. It helped us kind of structure it, put it together. But now as we put dark, light shapes and background with the variety of brush strokes that you can make, it really becomes a major part of it. How you deal with these shapes of negative space, shapes of background. So strategizing this, because I am creating lighter edges, when I come around with a little bit of darker line, they could mix, but they also could be, they could create a nice, really interesting shape, a nice, interesting mix, a nicer read. And I don't want to make all my brushstrokes similar. If you notice close up to the paint or the painting, the reference, you see that they're horizontal. They're going in this direction. You could begin to see that I'm working that in. So I could revisit some of these areas and just add it sideways. And all of these little elements, when you put them together, that was, I think, one of Van Gogh saying, you know, just like in nature, lots of small little things put together is what creates beauty. And respecting those, the importance of all of those little, what we would call small little things. Like the edge of a petal, for example. So you see how it starts gaining that volume. I want to jump over to, not wait too long, since I only have this one very small brush, I am going to have to clean it in between. If I go from very light, you don't want to add any white to your darker paints. You will tint them. So I'm going to go to this area here, grab some of it, pull it all the way into this green. At this point, you have so much variety of color. And I'm going to do something, which I mentioned before, I didn't finish the thought, Van Gogh didn't do much of, which is mix complementaries. So I mentioned I was going to add a little bit of red to this blue, but there's a touch of green in there. So it's really just going to go beyond the violet to almost a maroon color. I could add a little more blue, and you obviously see this color really, really dark on your screen. And it is a deep violet, but it has a red intensity that almost wants to read maroon. One way to know what this color really, really looks like, I'll give you a hint. we grab a little bit of white and we tint it. And that, so notice it's a really dark, it's a bluish violet, but it has some gray in it. So if I were to add a little more red, this serves as my darkest color that I want to use here. Now playing with that red and blue, making a deep, deep violet, and touching it with just a little bit of yellow, you begin to make black or a very, very dark gray. So when you mix your three primary colors in different ratios, you will have that. The other way it would be to bring in a little bit of burnt umber. I think I mentioned that. But you don't see a lot of black paint. They avoided it. Impressionists and post-impressionists, they avoided the use of black and mixed their own by using color theory. And I want to be very precise with some of this. So there's some deep blue, and I just want to begin to add just a touch of edges. So the way I manage the paint, mix it, and then use my vehicle, and I am using Painter's Medium, so you could see how it gets a little glossy. Now, when I add Painter's Medium, or if you're using acrylics, when you add a gel or an acrylic gel or a matte or a gloss gel, you also lighten the paint. You create a little variation of the purity of the color that you were working with. The more you add, the lighter the color gets. And it makes sense. It would be like adding more water to watercolor. Only there you lighten the value. Here you just lighten the overall. And I'm beginning to take a little bit of freedom with some of these shapes. What I am looking for is contrast. And you can begin to see some of these flowers really, really pop. And it just really needed that extra darkening of shadows. So this color is mixing, and that could be interesting. But you see how the shadow underneath and the darkening of some of these edges really begins to create volume. Now these are really, really fine brush strokes. When you get right here into the center of this flower, and you have color in the middle. So what would be a good strategy? Do you do the outline first, then color in the middle? Or do you do the middle and then try to outline it? It's going to be up to you and your brushing skills, the type of brush you're working with. How do you go about that? I'm using a smallest brush I have, creating the outline, doing the edges, and then I'm going to have a little bit of that paint mix with the interior color, which I already have as a layer. It's already set as flat, but I'm going to add a little bit of light curvature. So that directional brushstroke we talked about. And notice that there could be flowers in this painting that are a little more, I don't want to call them special, but they stand out more. They have a little more, or not protagonists, but bigger role. So reading a little bit into that as well. And a lot of patience. Van Gogh worked so fast, you could see it in his brushstroke. He would bring that vitality that is just so evident in his work by working energetically. Frantically is the word they use. But the truth is, he was taking his time and really, really giving each little element its due, and you are going to find, hopefully, your own pace. Now, before I get too carried away here with too much of this color, you're seeing that it begins to get dark. So, balancing it out. And in the end, that's one big thing that we're doing here. Trying to look for balance. Balance of textures, balance of brush strokes, balance of color contrast, balance of light and dark, balance in your composition. So when you think about balance, think of tightrope. And moving back over to a little bit of that darker green. So bringing over some painter's medium. And I want to mix a little bit of this deep blue-green. And I'm just going to bring it in and mix it into this darker color. So there's going to be a color bias. So all these different mixes that you begin to make on your palette, that more than anything is making you the artist in this work. You have all the decision, the power to make the decision. And it comes mostly from there. What you do in your palette. Think about how you're making that decision. Think about how you're thinking about color. And the more you think about color, the more comfortable you're going to be. Bringing it over. Very, very, very simple rules to that color mixing. Have your green. Does it need to be lighter, darker? Does it need to be cooler, warmer? Do I need to tint it? Do I need to add more yellow to it? Do I sense some blue in that green? Or is it more yellow? I'm beginning to see a little more yellow in these tips here. And therefore, a little more light. That's going to counteract the darkness at the edges of the work I've done right around here. And I need to bring some of that right in here as well. And you see it. So there's contrast. Just added a dark and light and place them right next to each other. I'm going to have to mix a lot more of this color because I'm starting to see it way more. And that is a big chunk of blue. With a tiny, tiny bit of yellow. That's how we brought it all the way over here. And then we tinted it. So how much blue? We're still somewhere over here. Good easy mix. Then I use some of this color left over on my So it's also a show of patience, as always. And it's mostly a show of patience in the way you observe your subject, the way you interpret your subject. take that to your palette, the way you mix and set up the colors for your subject, and then how you think through the application of those colors that you observed in your subject. This I think I need to do little by little, so let's just set it up here and begin mixing it. There it is. So now if it's a little too minty, we talked about this, we add a little more yellow. And if this gets a little deeper, I add more green. It's going to cool down, but it's going to look bluer. So you see that color there. And I am starting to see it almost at the edge, and as the highlights or color reflected off of some of these petals. And I'm making them really glossy. It needs more white. So we bring more white. Place it right over here. Notice that I'm working right at the edge. So the way you manage your colors and how you place them on your palette says a lot. How you're focusing, what you're focusing on. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to show me your palette. Because it's like in math, where you show me the answer, but then I want to see your work. Show me your work. Your palette tells everything. Tells the whole story. Zooming out sometimes, and you're going to hear me back up, stand up, take a look from 6 feet away. And then be able to see from a distance, just a little bit clearer, a few things that you need to enhance. You'll read it, and it'll make just a little more sense. And before you know it, you're in the zone. You're flying through this, answering thinking of this as a problem or as a puzzle, where you find the pieces and put them exactly where they need to be without forcing it. That's what you do. You begin to navigate, finding the right piece and placing it exactly where it belongs. So I'm beginning to mix a little bit of these two lighter tints of cobalt blue and this, call it turquoise mixture, that goes a little further into the green. And just consider some of these brush strokes, looking very, very closely. You cannot avoid that. The longer you stay without looking at your subject, the further away you're going to get from that painting you want. The more you look at your reference, the more accurate your painting is going to be. So think about that. If you're not looking at your reference, how can you see what you're looking for? It probably is one of the biggest, I don't want to say mistakes, but one of the biggest things that we don't have patience for. And it is trusting what we see, but in order to trust what we see, we need to see it first. If we're not looking at it, how are we going to see it? Learning how to, knowing what to look for, learning to understand what you need to look for, how to deconstruct it and how to make it simpler. Knowing how to have the patience to then bring that over, and then just really beginning to manage techniques and mastering a few techniques. I'm going to go ahead and do my first. I mentioned this is going to be a little bit of blue, a little tiny bit of red, and I'm looking for that. It's a red violet. I think that color's really close to what I'm looking for, but I'm going to add just a tiny bit of yellow. I do see it in there. And what am I looking for? It's a, if you look at the close-up, right in the center, there it is. That's it. So it almost becomes this yellowish, almost orange-brown color. It's not that heavy, but it shows up right in the middle of some of these flowers. Oof, that's too deep, too red. It needs a little bit more yellow. And maybe tint it just a little. So bring in a little bit of white. Yep, that looks a little bit better. Maybe just a tiny touch of red. Warm it up a little more. So you realize that, yeah, hey, it's about just being in a playground, playing with color, and you do that on your palette. But the exercise is observing. What am I trying to match here? So learning it, connecting with your subject. That's a little bit better. I want to show you up close what that color looks like right there. You just saw it. And it shows up very lightly in other areas, giving those flowers just a little bit of contrast. And it is almost a complementary color to that blue, where it does get a little yellower and a little bit lighter in some areas. It almost feels like just a tinted yellow. So I'm adding a lot more yellow over here to this side, with more white in it. So very tinted, and then I'm just going to bring in a little bit at a time. And this color actually seems more like it right at the edge. And we just touch it on. And there we have it. That is it right there. And then how accurate can you be with it? Notice that it's very light. Variations. It's not a lot of it. You cannot overdo this one. It's just a tiny, tiny little punch of color that gives you that light contrast, a little bit of variety, warms it up. And in some areas it does get a little bit yellower. Okay, time to move on. So that's my thing. I really get caught up with areas, and I'm working on one side of the painting. You could be working these same colors all over, wherever they are. And that is also an efficient way. Let's go ahead and switch brushes. Come back to this color actually, really quick. I'm going to move to that top the flower we see all the way at the top. Mix a little more of this color, going to the darks first. And we're going to bring a little bit of this outline kind of work. I'm going to begin to paint a little bit looser. What does looser mean? Just a little more energy in the stroke. A little more, it feels like drawing this outline, but putting down the paint with a little more confidence. Not forgetting, the one thing you don't do is stop looking. Pausing in order to get the right shapes. You see how very easily and quickly it can come together. Grab some of my background. I do see some of these edges, and I'm going to begin to work that first. And you see how it works a little bit sideways. And I'm going to add a little painter's medium to it as well, so it softens up right at the edge. And if it mixes a little bit with it, I'm going to allow it. How it goes in and around. So here I need to switch to a bigger, just a little bit of a bigger brush. Just refine some of this. Pull it all together, beginning to see the ensemble, like how one side of the painting is working with every other part. This background, just pulling it all together, making it uniform. And as my brush strokes get a little sharper in here, a little smaller, I'll switch my brush once again. Nice interesting shape right in here. And now back to the smaller brush. See how I planned this smaller little area? And some of these finer edges. So here's that trick I was talking about. Do I do the outline first or do I work inside out? Having some of that color mix. Mix a little more of this color. Make it deep. Just a little bit more violet. Adding a little vehicle. And begin working the inside. Not much, just a few lines here and there. Some of it I could actually work by mixing the paint in there. There's a beautiful, interesting blade of grass right here, but it's so thin, my brush may not allow me to get that kind of turn that it has going on with the line. But I'm going to try it. And now by bringing this deeper green right at the edge, and then a little bit lighter, right at the curve. Got a little bit yellower, and laying down some white tinted yellow right over it. It was one of those things that when you see it and it bothers you, take some time to revisit. Don't force it, don't rush it, but make sure you're capturing what you're seeing, or a version of it that is satisfying. So I'm beginning to get a little looser with some of these mixtures here as I begin to see the color a little bit sharper, and it begins to get away from those blues into those lighter tints and yellows. And begin to really play with paint application. Those broken, energetic brushstrokes. And now that the paint sits a little bit better, you can actually manage those brushstrokes much, much better, because the paint responds to the paint you've laid down. And there's a little bit of caking and edging and mixing. So it becomes to respond just, it becomes a little more fun too. There's a spot in the painting where you're working, you're building, you're not having fun, but then it reaches a moment when, ooh, okay, this is getting really fun. And instead of rushing through that, really milk it, because you're going to get a lot of great things happening right when you're feeling that. And there's one big realization that comes through feeling something like that, which is it's all about paint and what paint can do. That's it. So everything we've been doing, it's trying to get pigments, paint, to respond in a way and create the shapes in an arrangement that I'm kind of in control of, but also allowing paint to do the thing that it does. And what does it do? Well, you're seeing it as you're kind of becoming yourself, becoming the instrument. And the paint is showing you all these things it can do as a material, and you falling in love with it, just loving it and letting it happen. It is kind of a life lesson, the way life works, when when you think you need to be in control and then you realize, well, I was never in control. It was just a management of anxiety. So kind of surrendering, letting go of control, even though you are mixing the colors and bringing it in, letting paint do what paint does. And just enjoying that, the process, the experience. Now we're getting a little bit beyond just painting theory here, but it is trying to get there, where you're asking the question, why am I doing this? Well, it's philosophically speaking, you're looking for beauty, an expression of beauty that comes from within. But what more than that? Well, practice, experience, and coming to the conclusion that, well, it's kind of a meditative process. It is about the experience. So enjoying this moment with the subject, with the paint, and just being like a little child, wowed, oh wow, at all the little things paint can do. So I'm going a little bit into that cobalt blue, which you do see a lot of. We discussed it, him using directly. So it's a light tints of that cobalt blue. In other areas, there's a little bit of that turquoise or yellowing or even greening of that color. But overall, it's a base of that cobalt blue. And learning how to manage those variations. Sometimes you have to wait a little bit in certain areas to allow the paint to kind of settle in, dry a little, in order for you to come back and create a look. That can only happen if you let that paint sit for a while. So strategizing about that as well. Learning and understanding how paint behaves and anticipating and strategizing to use that to your advantage. So I said I was going to move to the other flower. Here we go. Here we go. Grabbing off of this, getting a little bit of that green off. Really reading the color, and it's all right in here. I have it all in here. It's just going to be a problem solution of paint application. Making sure I have the right color happening. I have those beautiful edges that I can now work inside out and create additional line with. And having that base color be able to get more cobalt and deeper, darker blue. So notice how the paint mixes there. And how I can just stroke it down, one efficient stroke, using a little bit of this painter's medium. And just have it sit. Also looking for a little bit of that thicker application of paint. Where now you begin to get in a rhythm. And you feel, okay, lighter color, darker color, inside, outside. Go to the white. Have an area of your palette where you just dip, dab, clean, dip, dab, clean. And then efficiently give it all this character. Seeing a little bit of green inside this flower right here. So not forgetting to look at your subject. If there's any takeaway from this series, it would be that pay attention to the way you're mixing your colors. Yes, strategies, techniques for drawing. Yep, important. All of it always falls right back into how connected, how closely are you looking? And sometimes, well, probably, very importantly, stands out. How long are you looking at your subject? Meaning you can actually count, put into terms of counting the time you're spending looking at your reference or looking at your canvas, and having a ratio of you're looking at your reference 90% more than you're looking at your canvas. Otherwise, it's not gonna. It eventually will work. You'll gain experience, but it means you're working from more of a memory place, imagination. You're not trying to understand and really interpret the thing you're seeing. And then strategies, techniques, the tips that work with color mixing or paint application, contrast, and all those tricks we talked about that just enhance and create the illusion. I'm going to use the same strategy, same technique as we continue moving a little bit further. So using this as my base layer, I'm going to start reading just a little bit more. Going into these deep greens over here, just a little bit. Finishing it up before I move back into the blues. Just seeing where it's going to pick up a little bit of it. Before I do that, I want to use painter's medium now. Kind of use a base color, not the same as my light layer, original layer that I used, and define some of these shapes with the second touch, where that color would actually go. So you see already, just with one little pop of color there, it begins working. It begins to give me a better idea of where I need to go next. And without rushing, see, I want to go a little bit deeper here right away. And remember that, which I think stands as crucial. Some of these light-dark contrast, when you see them so evident, so obvious, you want to put them in, lay them down. Because that is the type of contrast that makes or breaks a painting. It is what we're looking for. The combination of light, dark on a subject Going back into, adding a little white here and there, speed up the process. But you need to be doing this with your reference in mind. I use that term, making up information. That's the one thing you don't want to be doing. No matter how good you are at making up information, it's a different type of painting if you're doing that. I'm not saying you can do it. Of course you can. But it's a different type of painting. You're working from a different place, the symbol of what you think a flower looks like, not what this exact one in front of me is telling me, or what I can pick up from it. Which is why, biggest tip I can offer, don't forget to look at your reference. That's where all the answers are. And you are looking for those answers. They're right there. It's figuring out how to kind of declutter the information, simplify it, and understand what do I need to look for? How do I forget about all the other little things and make my focus understand the thing that I need to be looking at right now, right here. What is it? So notice I see a lot of negative space and how it becomes just a lot lighter and brighter and funner. So can I use that to my advantage with the little contrast of pops of dark and blue, and I see some of that blank canvas coming through. I mentioned there are areas where you do want, as soon as you see them, mark them out, and whether it's contrast or in this case negative space, small little pockets of light or dark that make all the difference. Make sure you give yourself those markers so you're not guessing, especially with a complex subject like this. You'll be, again, it's like those, like putting together that puzzle and not losing your place. This helps you find your place as you're looking through all the information. So my question is this flower done? I'm going to wait just a little bit. I was talking about how that paint settles in. I'm going to wait just a little bit to let it kind of get a little thicker and be able to come back and touch it. But it is done. I see it as you don't need to do much to it. Once you reach a point where you're overdoing it, you're risking everything. All the work you've put in is at jeopardy. So knowing when to stop. And I'll say it again and again and again. Knowing how to navigate your palette and through your canvas. Gets a little darker. And what ends up happening is I get to see what you were seeing. All of us, we all get to see what you were seeing, and gets to the point where we get to see how you were seeing it and how you were interpreting it. And even further, we may be able to feel how you were feeling. That is an achievement right there. That is what we're trying to do. The way you feel about this subject. If you just feel na 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 that way, we're going to look at it just like that. Na 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 na. But if you feel so intrigued and passionate about this corner of, and again, I simplify it, contrasting shapes of brushstrokes and color, we're going to feel the same way. And being able to develop your own strategies, your own methods. There is no other way. You learn a few things from people here and there, but it's about realizing how you see, how you think, how much patience you have, and becoming aware of it so you can catch yourself in the moment. Sometimes you just get tired or hungry. So knowing how to take a break, also very important. Before you regret going a little farther, wishing you, I should have paused and took a break and come back refreshed with a new, energized attitude, that can make all the difference. So all these factors, all these little things, they all fall on you. So adding just a variation of the base color on top of that layer plus tinting, it's almost it's forcing me now to, and I'm beginning to see it, where I need to get darker and begin to break some of these shapes. I could keep going all the way. Would that be efficient? There's a lot of breaks in greens. So this part of the strategy, I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to keep adding white, tint it, a little cobalt, manage the spectrum of this color. I'm adding that painter's medium, the gloss, to it, and really trying to break these shapes. If you were to see me right now, my face is on my reference, and I'm not looking at my canvas, but for a few fractions of a second, as I place my brush where I think it needs to be, so for example, down here, I look for my connection right here, down there. Once I place it down, I'm looking at my reference to try and capture that shape. And this is a very forgiving subject. So while I'm stroking the paint on and I'm looking at the actual subject, I am going to capture some of that some of the form, some of the light, some of the movement. And you could see Van Gogh doing this. You could see it in his every single brushstroke. It's almost like he's touching every petal with his eyes. And trusting what he sees, and then just bringing it over to the canvas. But the moment you take your eyes off your subject, realize what you're doing, you're not looking. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of practice to give yourself that permission, that trust, that yes, I can see it, I can look at it, and then what's the worst that could happen? Except seeing it better. And I told you that in my drawing there are variations. I did not capture the composition exactly like I would have wanted to. So there's a little bit of modification to how I see some of these petals. Now I get to see them a little bit better. And can I paint right over it? Yeah. Is it going to do much to the paint underneath or the composition that I have going on here? No, I could reshift. I could just really just paint over this entire thing. Now, don't want to do that. This color's not really matching there. It is more of that orangey yellow color. And there's a lot of background work that I need to do in here. But I did mention I need to get darker. Break up some of these shapes. So we'll need more cobalt blue and a way to darken it. And manage those variations of dark blue to dark green. So we have one big shape happening here. And I do like how it's looking. All right. A little more cobalt blue. There we are. Still have a lot of green that I could deal with, work with here. I want to take a quick look at some of these edges here and grab some of this white. Kind of break the background from some of these shapes. I want to do that early on before I get to those darks. And there's a lot of beautiful shifting negative space here. And you see what that's going to do to the composition. Does not have to be your strategy. Your strategy could be continuing with building up the petals. But there's so many like beautiful, beautiful little streaks of, and it's going to really enhance some of these blades of, call it grass, but you know what I mean. Reshaping some of these early layers of outline that I had going on here, making this paint a lot thicker right over on this side of my painting, and just building it up little by little. But you see how it really gives it a closer to finished feel. Not using a lot of painter's medium. I'm using just kind of impasto painting, just what I mixed on my canvas, on my palette, bringing it right over. It doesn't need that because of the previous layer that I added. And the break in my brush strokes that we talked about, adding that sideways horizontal kind of motion to the brush stroke. And all of these smaller shapes. In a way, it's kind of like drawing it again. And I'm going to actually make this a lot lighter. So it doesn't really blend with the background, but just that edge of that lighter petal, which will be a little more orange in the end. Not a lot of background to contend with here. I'm going to go ahead and touch this up a little further. I could use just cobalt blue, but it is, and I'm going to test it here on this outer edge of this petal. Let's use a little painter's medium, soften that, give it more fluidity, a little bit of gloss, but deep, just straight out of the tube cobalt blue. And I'm going to add some just quick lines, almost outlines, and see how that works. And it worked beautifully. It did work beautifully. If I need to darken it, I would go a little towards the violet. Just a deeper version of this blue. One thing you definitely don't want to do is add white. If it mixes just a little bit, make sure you get it off your brush. Otherwise, those deep colors are going to start tinting. You don't see me do this, but every time I lay down a brush stroke like this, bring it in, don't go over it, just done. Wipe whatever paint you got on the brush. That way you're bringing it almost 100% pigment again. Add a little more. Painter's medium. And knowing how to just dab it in, move away, instead of just picking up paint that's on the canvas and disturbing it would be the word I use, because it is set, it is beautiful, you capture that brush stroke, but every time you move it around, more and more you're taking away that uniqueness of what can be captured in that one quick brushstroke, broken brushstroke. And you see master painters, every painter that you consider, I don't want to say every, but most of the modern, from Impressionism on, you're going to see them mastering this technique, where you have just absolute confidence in bringing that loaded paintbrush, laying it down, and just in one motion being able to capture and giving it that body, that texture, and in this case the energy and the injection of life or movement that we see. Question: have you been looking at your reference? Especially when you're doing stuff like this. And I'm going to say one final thing. It's about you giving yourself permission. That's it. Give yourself permission to do anything you want on the palette, on the canvas. Realizing that, I think, is the biggest thing, the biggest moment. Oh yeah, I get to do whatever I want, and it's okay. That is priceless. Now, being comfortable doing that and navigating how you're satisfied with that, because you will judge it. And because you did it, you know it so well. You're so familiar with the steps you took that you may judge it too hard. So be kind. Be very kind to yourself and to your work. Because the more permission you give yourself, usually the tendency is the harder you're going to judge it. Well, you could have done anything, and then I go and do this. Be nice. Be kind. And more than anything, just enjoy the moment. Enjoy this process. Because you'll end up with a nice, beautiful painting. But in the end, it's all about here, right now. From the palette to the canvas and your connection to the subject. That it's what you're looking for. And with that, I want to thank you for joining me with this beautiful session of who better to learn from than Van Gogh? And I hope you enjoyed it.